So every year you might be hearing of forest fires that happen. These happen across India all the time, and these are usually set by people for various purposes, including criminal reasons like arson. But what happens is usually the understory of forests which catch fire have short vegetation. So which means that most of these fires are ground fires. But what happens when lantana is there is, if it grows really tall, and sometimes if it climbs into tree canopies, then if a fire happens, then the fire can actually reach the canopy of trees. Trees are adapted at ground level to face fires, but they're not very well adapted to canopy fires. So this is actually detrimental for species that are there in Indian forests. So a species like lantana being in a forest which gets fire often can change how species there are responding to disturbances such as fire. There are other kinds of ecosystem level changes also that invasive species can bring about. Things like soil nutrient cycling, or how much carbon is stocked in the soil and in the wood of invasive species. All of these things can be affected by the presence of a woody invasive species like lantana. So, not that
Uh,
anyone is, yeah, hello?
Geeta, sorry to disturb you.
No
This
issue.
about forest fires. This is a very different. Like I didn't know this. So there are no other species that grow to that height. Like lantana is only exception that it will make the possibility of canopy fire.
Yes, in the type of forest that we find in peninsular India, climbing plants are more likely to bring fire to the canopy. And the extent to which we find things like lantana in these forests now is much more than other climbing plants. So the impact of
Okay.
lantana is likely to be proportionally much more. Yeah. So you can see, like in this photo, in this particular photo, this is the kind of invasion that you see in forests in India by lantana. For as far as you can see, it's lantana. And when lantana was not there, this forest was actually invaded by in in all across its invasive ranges. It has already formed associations with pollinators such as butterflies. And even today, across the country, if anyone wants to set up a butterfly park, one of the first species that is recommended in a butterfly park, is lantana, which is really it's a little bit scary also, because we know that it's a very invasive plant, and it's causing a lot of problems in all kinds of natural habitats. But still, it's a species that is recommended because lepidopterans, like butterflies, love lantana. So they have now also in certain forest areas become dependent on lantana for nectar resources. The other association that lantana has managed to form is with frugivores, and frugivores are essential in helping expand the range of species. Plants are rooted to a spot; they can't move. So the only way their ranges can expand is by dispersing their seeds very far away from the parent plant. The dispersal has also lots of advantages for the seed itself. It may be, by being dropped somewhere far away from the parent plant, it is escaping the shading effects of the parent plant or the parasites from the parent plant. So it has an advantage by being dispersed by a vertebrate across a large distance. And a variety of vertebrates actually eat lantana. There are lots of birds, especially common birds. This here is a white-browed bulbul, a very voracious eater of lantana. Many other species of bulbuls like the red-vented bulbul, red-whiskered bulbul, they all love lantana. And locally, they are responsible for dispersing this species.
Capitone जातो है तिकडे.
The other trick that lantana has up its sleeve is that it's a rapid regenerator. So you can cut, if you want to remove lantana, the only way to do is uproot it. That's the only way to kill a plant. Because if you just top it on top, it does something called coppicing, which is as long as the root is intact, it will just sprout right back and it will become bushier and bushier instead of growing tall. The other thing it does is it has a huge, it produces lots and lots of seeds. A single plant can produce lots of seeds, which can get stored in the soil seed bank. And once the top layer of vegetation is removed by mistake or by design, these seeds will just sprout right back into little seedlings. I looked at several of these. Oh, sorry. So this is just a little detour because of all these strategies that Lantana has up its sleeve. I like to call it the Hydra-headed plant because in the Greek mythology, there was this monster called the Hydra, which had to be killed by Hercules. And the only problem was that if you cut one head of this Hydra, it will sprout 7 more in the space of that one head. So Lantana is exactly like that. If you do one thing to remove it, it has several other strategies to come right back. So we tried to look at some of these strategies that Lantana has and thought, can this be applied to actually managing Lantana? And we looked at Lantana across different habitats in Mudumalai and Bandipur BRT in Karnataka, and in Rishi Valley in Chittoor in Andhra, and in Rajaji National Park in Uttarakhand. Across these different landscapes, which are really important for wild, like charismatic species like the elephant, tiger, deer, leopard, you name it. We try to understand why the management of the species actually fails. Why is it that people keep removing? It's there in all the forest management plans, but still it's still a problem after 150 years of being introduced to India. Why is it still a problem? And we found that Lantana is managed in a certain way. It's usually removed in linear patches or from very small regions which have tourist importance. But what happens is that because of this association with dispersers like bulbuls, Lantana is able to come back into managed areas in no time. So if you go to a managed area from where Lantana has been removed, within the next 6 months, you will see seedlings of Lantana and older stems of Lantana sprouting right back. And these seedlings of Lantana are most likely coming back into managed areas because of common widespread birds such as bulbul, for which Lantana forms an important part of the diet. And we figured this out by tracing the movement of birds like bulbul. So we put a little radio tag on the bulbul, and we saw how far it moved and how far it was able to disperse the seed of Lantana after eating it. And based on this, we suggested a management plan to the forest department, where we said, okay, don't go around removing Lantana from everywhere. That's just not possible. Across India, more than 1.3 million hectares of land is covered by Lantana. What we can do instead is prioritize areas which are really important for animals such as elephants, deer, endemic birds, those kinds of regions, and you remove Lantana from there. And then every consecutive year, you keep increasing that area such that nearest source plants, the nearest plants from where bulbuls can disperse Lantana back, is farther and farther and farther away. So for example, if this is the landscape of interest, then each subsequent year, we keep removing more and more Lantana around it, such that the distance between these two keeps increasing. Now, this was a suggestion we had made. I don't think any manager has been able to implement this yet, but well, it's out there, and we hope that someday some managers will be able to use this suggestion. So coming back to the idea of climate change, not only is it a clear and present danger, right? An invasive plant is here right now, but it is going to continue being a problem in the future as well. And why is that? Because under future climate change scenarios, as temperatures increase, more and more areas might become suitable for a plant like Lantana. Some of my colleagues here from Wildlife Institute of India have modeled, how the distribution of Lantana is likely to increase. And they suggest that there are many more potential areas all across India where Lantana can be present in the future. As climate changes. So this, okay, I'm going to make an abrupt transition here because I want to also talk about the seasonality of plants. and how that is affected by climate change.
One
So
small
yes,
question, Geeta, here.
yes.
When is there any efficient way of uprooting lantana, because it is so like itchy and all? It's not possible to do it manually. So how do they do it?
Yes, it is very difficult. Everywhere in India, so one or the other type of manual method is used to remove lantana. The primary way is to manually uproot. So people are actually made to dig out from the lantana from the roots and uproot it. In some places, they may use large machines like JCBs to uproot large, portions of lantana. In some places, they might use elephants, trained elephants to uproot lantana. In one place in Uttarakhand and Rajaji, there is this practice of cutting the meristem of lantana just under the soil, such that the regenerating meristem is destroyed and the lantana can't grow back again. So that is also one method. All of these methods are effective in removing individuals of lantana when it is a small patch of lantana. But imagine hundreds of hectares, very difficult.
Geeta ma'am,
Yes.
can we see that map again? Why India is only shown like that earlier map? Just only. And what about other places haven't been affected so much, or your study is only for India?
No. So this is not my study. This is a study from Wildlife Institute of India. Here, if you see this is actually showing the different ranges of lantana. So this is the native range. This is where lantana evolved.
Got it. Presence in native. I
Yes.
couldn't read it. Presence in global
okay.
invaded range and presence in. Okay, all right.
So who is the natural enemy over there, and what is the importance of lantana? If we human can understand the importance of lantana, we will abuse it. So we'll make it ulta.
Yeah. So in its natural range, it would have herbivores. It would have insect. There are species of beetles that eat the seeds of lantana, so they directly harm the seeds. And this type of they've tried to introduce the same species in invaded ranges, but it has not been very successful. So so there are natural predators for the seed and for the leaf in the native range of lantana.
So instead of removing the plant, can we just remove the flowers and work that way around?
That's a great idea, except that if you think about the extent of invasion, we are talking hundreds of hectares in any given place. It's not one or two plants; it is hundreds of hectares.
But it has to do with the climate also here, because these Australia and these other places don't have. It's only in Mexico and this.
Right. So the evolutionary origin of a species can depend on many things. Why it evolved there could be very much a function of the local environmental conditions over there. That's right.
Okay.
But if you see, it's the same latitude.
That's what. That's what I was saying.
Yeah. So they do very well on the same latitudes, but also much further south in Australia, they are doing well. In Africa, they are doing well. In fact, the kind of climatic and environmental niches that invasive species are found in invaded range, like in India, is much more than what is there in the native range. So here in the native range, people will not expect lantana to grow in hilly regions where it becomes really cold or where there is frost.
Yeah, exactly.
But in India, you can see it everywhere. In every hill station, you will find lantana, even when there is cold and frost, right?
And it is taken as is it taken as a natural beauty by the people who don't know that it's invasive?
Probably, yeah. I have seen many people like getting off in the middle of a forest to take photos with the flowers because they look so pretty, So they don't know. Yeah. People are not aware. Yeah, absolutely. So there are many methods of managing, and there might be many new methods of also managing, but just the extent of invasion is so bad. There is just so much of it that it can be only contained locally at very small scales. So that is the only problem.
Excuse me, ma'am.
So
If we
Yeah.
Nilimatai, just a
Huh.
second here.
Well.
Geeta, shall we take the questions at end? Because
Sure.
because
Okay,
with this
we'll do
we
it.
will have
Running-
questions for season watch as well. So
Yes.
let us club them at the end. All right.
Sure.
Yeah,
Sounds
yeah.
good.
Yeah, Nilimatai, you can come back at the end.
Yeah, sure.
Yes.
Maybe
Yeah,
by
yeah,
that
yeah.
time my question will get answered.
Yeah. Actually, one of the things that invasive species also seem to have lost is this seasonality in flowering and fruiting. Many exotic species, many invasive species are reported to have continuous flowering and fruiting, throughout the year. Like every time is conducive for them for flowering and fruiting. But that is not so for native species. Native species are very specific. They, require certain types of conditions to flower and fruit. So just to quickly talk about that seasonality, this is just a series of photos to get across the idea of phenology or the study of seasonality. So the first photo is actually that of a common crow butterfly, which shows seasonal migration or directional movement according to season. This is the pied cuckoo or the Jacobin cuckoo. Also shows local seasonal migration across the peninsular India, and it's often called the harbinger of the monsoon. So just before the monsoon arrives, you will see this bird in various parts of peninsular India. So this is a seasonal movement of this bird. Then this third species is a plant. It's the ghost tree or Sterculia urens, very common across dry forests of India. This adult tree shows seasonal dropping of leaves or seasonal deciduousness, followed by putting out flowers, followed by putting out fruits, and then recovery of the lost leaves. So this species is known to be leafless for almost 6 months of a year. And in the meantime, it also does production of flowers, production of fruits, and so on. So the study of these seasonal and cyclical changes that occur in different organisms is known as phenology. And studying plant phenology can be especially valuable to understand things like climate change. So to just quickly give you an example, in temperate regions, called the pedunculate oak, puts out leaves as soon as the weather is conducive. So in the winter, it will drop all of its leaves, remain inert throughout the winter because metabolism is not possible during the winter in temperate regions. And then with the onset of spring, which is increase in daytime temperature, it will put out new leaves. Now, these new leaves form the fodder for the larvae of the winter moth. And the winter moth larvae will feed voraciously on these new emerging leaves of the pedunculate oak. And these in turn form the food for birds like the Paris major, which also coincidentally nest at the same time, or they could be migrating towards these warmer areas at the same time, or nesting. So both migration and nesting may coincide with when the winter moth larvae come out, because they eat the winter moth larvae, and the winter moth larvae come out when the pedunculate oak puts up new leaves. So it's a life cycle that is intricately intertwined. Now with global warming induced climate change, spring in temperate regions is setting in earlier than usual. So up to 10 days or 14 days earlier than usual. So what that means is the oak is putting out leaves 14 days before time. And 14 days is a long time in the life cycle of something like a winter moth larva. So the winter moth larva now has to adapt to hatching 14 days earlier so that it has tender leaves to eat. And they have managed to do that also. Winter moth larvae actually hatch earlier now. But larger animals like the songbirds that depend on eating these larvae have to now reprogram their migration or nesting time to find these larvae as food. So that has not happened yet. That is a much more difficult thing to happen, to evolve so quickly. So now, because of climate change and the change in phenology of a tree, there is a change in phenology of other organisms downstream. And this is happening in the temperate regions. But what is happening in tropical regions where we live in peninsular India? It's more complicated. The story is very complicated, actually. because all species don't behave the same way across the same type of temperature and climate regions. So some species may decide to be deciduous and drop their leaves in the dry cool season. Many other species don't do that. There may be other types of leaf growing strategies other than deciduousness. The same species could have multiple flowering and fruiting cycles in one region, and in another region may have only one fruiting or flowering cycle. So depending on where it's located, the geography of the species also, the phenology changes quite dramatically. And though there are studies that suggest that temperature, precipitation, day length, all of these affect many aspects of phenology, it's still it's not very clear how something like climate change the phenology of tropical trees. And from there, how that is likely to affect other species that are dependent on the flower for pollen or flower for nectar or fruit for food. How is it affecting those species? We do not know. And to understand something as large scale as climate change on diverse groups of species, we need a certain type of information, scientific information, which has to be large scale and long term. And in India and in other tropical regions, mainstream scientific research has been limited mostly because of logistics to smaller scale studies over short term. And by short term, I mean 2 to 5 years. There are very few studies that go beyond 5 years to say 10 years or 20 years. There are very few studies across India that have managed to do that. But that is precisely the type of data that we require to understand something that is long-term and large-scale, like climate change. And this is where citizen science comes into play, because professional scientists are limited by how much they can observe in a particular amount of time. Citizen scientists can contribute to understanding a large complex problem like climate change by contributing one data point, across consistently, either across space or across time. So what is citizen science? It's basically scientific research conducted by non-professional scientists, where people are themselves responsible for producing the scientific knowledge. And this knowledge is open to all. And it is responsive to what people actually need in their lives, rather than what researchers are curious about. It's also about applying what you know and what you observe to your daily life. So citizen science is a great opportunity to become involved as a scientist in the process, in the scientific understanding of a complex process. This type of gathering of information is also great because it is especially conducive to gathering lots of information over large spatial scales and over large temporal scales. So for example, I've just shown an example here of a citizen science program called iNaturalist, which looks at the distributions of different species across space. And here you see the distribution of the Bengal monitor lizard. And you see all the regions in India from where Bengal monitor lizards have been reported. Now, if one scientific lab or a group of scientists was trying to do this level of understanding of the range of monitor lizards, it's not going to be as much. It's not going to be of this level. The other thing you can see here is understanding of something like bird migration or presence absence of birds according to season. And this is available on a citizen science project called eBird, where for different species of birds, you can see across the year when you are most likely to find it. So citizen science in bio is especially useful for ecology and biodiversity studies because it is great for inventorying the biodiversity and great for understanding things like seasonality. And it's not a new concept. Citizen science is not a new concept. It's been there for a very long time. One of the oldest citizen science projects is in the city of Kyoto in Japan, where civil society has been keeping a record of the flowering of a culturally iconic tree called the cherry tree, Japanese cherry tree, and recording when it is at peak flower. And you can see that the date, the first record actually goes back 1200 years in 880. And the cool thing is that scientists plotted the date of maximum flowering in the cherry blossom across all these 1200 years. And they found that for nearly 1000 years, this date was between 10th and 20th of April. But after the onset of the Industrial Revolution over the last 200 years, it has actually gone from 1st to 10th of April. So remember how, a change in the date of flowering can affect other species dependent on this flowering. So we don't know what is the impact of the shift by 10 days of the flowering in cherry blossom in the city of Kyoto. So fascinating data, citizen science data from this place. And let me also give you an example of large-scale understanding of seasonality in species. There is a program called the USA National Phenology Network, where people across the USA contribute information on the flowering of certain select species in their own backyards or wherever they meet the species around. And based on what people are recording, they can create maps of when the species flowers in relation to what is historically known. So here in this map, you can see all these red regions are places where the species that were being monitored flowered earlier than usual than expected historically. Whereas all these blue regions show species that flowered later than expected. So climate change at this large spatial scale is affecting different species in different ways. So do we have a comparative type of citizen science program in India looking at seasonality of trees? Yes, and that is the project that I lead. It's called Season Watch. It's a very exciting project because we now have more than 4 lakh observations from the time that it was started in 2010, 10 years ago. And we have a large number of trees that are being observed. If you just ignore this regular and casual trees, we have a total of more than 90,000 trees that have been observed across India by more than 1,200 interested individuals and more than 1,200 schools. And thousands of children across these 1,200 schools have been looking at monitoring trees in their own backyards, in their gardens, and contributing information for understanding the seasonal response of Indian trees better. And this they do in 2 ways. They register with us either on our website or on our Android app. And you just have to create a login. And once you have created a login, you have to register 1 or more trees. And you just continue observing these registered trees over time. And we recommend once per week observation. And this sort of gives us a very nice understanding of the seasonality of trees. So for example, in this map, which you can access on our Explore page on the Season Watch website, you can select information by state and by species and by what you want, and by phenophase, which is leaf, flower, or fruit. And for any given set of dates, you can find all the trees that were recorded across India with this particular phase, which is fruit. And you also get this neat little graph, which tells you when the peak, when was the peak in which month for that particular year for this particular species. So this is the way that all the data that comes in is available for viewing on our website also. So we monitor 134 species of commonly available trees.
I just wanted to ask one small question. Is Kerala has done maximum work, is it?
Yes, yes. And we have been trying to find another state that can give Kerala this tough competition. I think Maharashtra is the state to give Kerala tough competition if it takes off.
Yeah.
Yeah. Kerala schools are also they are the most, contributory over there. Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, so we have 134 species which are commonly found, easily recognizable, culturally important, or locally, endemically, they are more common. So some species you might encounter very often on our website is this is jackfruit, or palash, or kadam,
काय
and amaltas.
त्यांनी ते उपमा केला होता
And
उपमा खाल्ला
sorry,
Can you, yeah, go on.
yeah. And these are all native species that are highly seasonal, which produce flower and fruit in a particular season, and they may also be deciduous in a particular season. We also have few seasonal exotic species like this copper pod, and we have two invasive species also on our list, which is lantana and prosopis. Now, the point of including all this diverse group of species is firstly accessibility, because citizen scientists may be living in areas which don't have access to forestry species. So we have kept that in mind and put those species which people are very likely to find in along avenues in cities or in farms in rural areas. Or even if they're forest trees, they're very easily recognizable, like this flame of the forest tree, which when it's flowered, it's very clear that it's a flame of the forest. Or culturally important trees and edible fruit trees like jackfruit and mango. So how does one actually do an observation for season watch? It's very easy. We can also do a specific training session specifically to go through the different steps of doing season watch, but actually it's really simple. You just have to download the app on your phone, find a tree that you want to monitor, like this palash tree, which is in full bloom. So let's look at the phenophases, or the different stages of the trees that are visible in this particular photograph. So you may notice that there are no leaves. I can't see any leaves in this photograph, but there are lots of buds, flower buds, and lots of flowers. And there seem to be no fruits yet. The fruits will be, the unripe fruit will be green, and the ripe fruit might be brownish, greenish brown. So neither ripe fruit nor unripe fruit are present here. We then estimate a quantity of the leaf, flower, and fruit. What we do is basically we imagine the canopy of the tree to be like a pizza, and we cut it into thirds. And depending on how many thirds the particular stage is present in, we call it none, few, or many. So if you don't see a particular phase in any of the thirds, then you call it none or absent. So for example, fresh leaves, mature leaves, and dying leaves, none of these leaf stages are present in any of the thirds here. So we mark all of those as, we just select none. But if you look at buds are there in all the thirds. It's there in this third. You can see some buds here. You can see some buds here. So it's there in all the thirds. So we mark that as many. Similarly, for open flowers, open flower is this red one, which is also there in all the thirds. So we mark that as many. But fruits are absent. So we mark that as there are no unripe fruits and there are no ripe fruits. So this is fairly intuitive. If you look at the app, it's very intuitive and easy to, just quickly click on all of these. And maybe for the first couple of times, you may take 5 minutes to understand what's happening on a tree. But the more you do it, the easier it becomes and the faster you can be at recording these things about your tree. Then you can also record whether, pollinators or birds or other animals were there on the tree. Make a note of that. You can create natural history notes for yourself, and then you can just save this observation after, selecting the date of observation. So that's all. This is just one observation that a person makes. And this basically goes into creating this lovely map over here of the seasonality of different species. When many people together contribute this information over a long period of time, we are able to get lovely understanding of seasonality. So I'll quickly give you an example of what we have been able to understand about some of the common species. So firstly, which are the most observed species? Okay. So sorry, do we have to leave again and rejoin?
Yes, in 4 minutes time. Apologies, Geeta, for this.
No problem, no problem. So I'll finish this slide and
Yeah.
we can exit. Yeah. So
Yeah.
actually, yeah. So not surprisingly, the top 4 species that are observed in season watch are fruit trees that we all love these fruits very much. There is fanas and there is mango and there's tamarind and amla. And these things that you see here are the number of observations on number of trees. So this number is less than this number because repeat observations are allowed on trees. The same tree can be observed multiple times. So the same, nearly 2,000 trees have been observed for more than 50,000 times. Okay, so I'll stop share and rejoin.